Hello, my name is Ryan Williams, and I'm writing a doctoral thesis on whether social media can be incorporated into pedagogy successfully. I'm using this YouTube channel for reflective purposes, and today's video is on some of the key themes that I found during my research. My thesis is titled An Exploration into the Pedagogical Benefits of Social Media. Can educators incorporate social media into pedagogy successfully? I had 3 phases of data collection in my project, and that consisted of a round of surveys, and they were analysed quantitatively, and then I had 2 follow-up phases of interviews. My aims were that I were primarily looking at the relationship between pedagogy and social media and the factors that influence engagement with these platforms. I also looked at the benefits of social media in the classroom in terms of engagement and academic achievement. In total, 434 participants took part in my study. All participants had QTS, and they had to have 1 year of teaching experience, so I excluded NQTs from my study. So this purposeful sampling was to avoid any new teachers who hadn't have or potentially not have completed any CPD in relation to technology in teaching. I conducted my study with secondary teachers across the UK, and I focused on secondary specifically because, primarily because of the copper law and the concept that you have to be 13 years old to be able to use social media. So I thought I would be able to get better experiences of teachers using technology with this particular age group. COVID-19 happened midway through my data collection, and this meant that the whole country was working remotely, and that included schools as well. So I was now in a position whereby all teachers were using some social or learning platform for teaching and learning purposes. So at the start of my data collection, some teachers were recalling experiences from a few years ago, whereas now they were recalling experiences from that particular day or that week in teaching. I was very conscious that I didn't want it to become a study just on COVID-19 during the pandemic. But I have to acknowledge, and I do in my thesis, that COVID-19 was advantageous for my work in general. The surveys were analysed using descriptive statistics, and the interviews were done thematically, and in a way where the themes didn't just appear at the end. I got to see them grow through the analysis process, and I think much of that was because Travellers' sociocultural theory underpinned my work, and it supported how I collected data and how I analysed the data as well. There were 4 major themes in my study, and the first one is in relation to CPD in TEL. So I argue in my study that CPD is really underdeveloped in this area, and this was evidenced through various teacher accounts of them using social media in their pedagogy quite regularly. Every day they were using some form of YouTube, and especially during the pandemic, but they were having 0 CPD on this, and this wasn't just exclusively for social media. This is one of the big challenges that TEL has had in general, and there was no evidence of transformative professional development taking place, such as most of it didn't consider teachers' personal and social factors. And a lot of the times, if when it was taking place, it was very instructional. There were also problems and issues with who was delivering the training, as teachers did mention that it was either somebody from the pastoral team delivering any CPD, or it was a member of SLT, or it was just a teacher who had kind of been roped into this role because they were quite tech savvy. So in all them examples, there wasn't one qualified person to deliver training in this regard. There were also issues with time and frequency. So this was often late and way after any implementation periods. So I know the teachers using technology was quite rushed during the pandemic, but even before then, teachers were advocated on a particular platform, but they'd have no training on it until maybe 6 months afterwards. So teachers had already begun using platforms during the pandemic before any training had commenced, and it was almost like an afterthought there. Finally, the actual content that was taking place tended to focus on the technical aspects rather than the pedagogical applications of technology. And I think this also links into who was delivering the training, as pastoral team members would focus on the cyberbullying and digital footprint aspect of social media, whereas the SLT would focus on the our schools just expensed a huge amount on these iPads. Let's use them. Let's get them out. Let's show the school that we can use technology, and our school is competent at using technology. I argue that there are profound differences in the relationship and interactions between technological tools and specific pedagogical practices. In this instance, CPD focusing on technology and the skills associated with using an iPad, for instance, is disconnected from this idea. I also argue that CPD ought to be transformative, as illustrated in Kennedy's typologies. I argue that because technology moves so quickly, educators must have an understanding of effective and solid pedagogical strategies rather than focusing on the technology itself, as them skills quickly become outdated. However, this does require a greater time and effort from the schools, and this is something that we may not have. My second theme is that there is a lack of thought to pedagogy from policymakers, and we can go right to the top of governance for this, but I just want to focus on policy making at a school level. And there were some great examples during lockdown when policy and the process of changing gave no thought whatsoever to pedagogy. As an example, some teachers gave an account of their school had purchased this software to use during the pandemic so that kids could continue learning at home and expand the learning beyond the four walls. However, there was nowhere on that particular software to assess children. So that was something that the school had gone out and purchased. Perhaps it was a good deal, or they kind of got sold it over the phone. But there was no thought to the assessments, and all the teachers that were using this software would always say that there was nowhere to assess students. And in examples where there were, you'd have teachers having to kind of click around 4 or 5 different screens just to look at what a student has done today, as opposed to looking in a school book and everything being there. This goes back, and a lot of literature does support this, and there's a general theme that policymaking in TEL doesn't consider pedagogy, and this is the same with social media. There was actually a point where schools were advocating the use of Facebook to kind of get school messages out there. They were directing parents and kids to their Facebook page, whereas at the same time their school policy actually banned any of this. So there was definitely some conflicts there, and their outdated policy didn't reflect what they were doing at that time. The third theme is that there are distinctions between social media in the personal and social media in the professional. And what I'm essentially arguing here is that we shouldn't group all the different types of social media together, because there are different purposes, and some of the platforms are very different. As an example, YouTube was the most popular social media, and Twitter was the second most popular, whereas these were almost on the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of what teachers were using them for. Teachers were using YouTube for the pedagogy stuff, to demonstrate science experiments that you couldn't necessarily do in a classroom. whereas teachers were using Twitter to share ideas with other educators for networking purposes. So they were used for very different things, and I think grouping them together is irresponsible in a way. The fourth theme links into my previous theme, and I argue that the term tell may in fact be problematic. It's a term that we use quite a lot in academia, but in teaching they weren't too familiar with that theme. There are huge differences between technology and social media, and this is down to how you use it and what you use the technologies for. I argue that social media is a paradox in the traditional sense, because it was first implemented with the general population before education, whereas other types of technology such as personal computers were first implemented in the classroom, then they became popular with the wider general population. So whenever I would use the term tell, teachers would just defer to iPads. And iPads was a strange one, because they aren't seen as particularly useful in schools and in the classroom, and they're used for primarily administrative purposes or to substitute tasks that could have been done on paper. So you've got some kind of timetables to do on paper, now you're doing it on an iPad, direct substitution of a task. Whereas social media is very different because it can transform the pedagogy. So activities that were previously inconceivable could now be done using these social platforms. And I think grouping everything under this tell umbrella term has led to some confusions when teachers are talking about technology, because I think teachers were kind of under the impression that social media is very similar to an iPad, where it might be good, but the benefits in terms of the pedagogy side would be the same as the iPad, which can become idle in the classroom. I think in general, my study's 4 themes illustrate the challenges associated with successfully embedding technology in education, and in particular social media. Thank you for watching.